What's up, everybody? Cinephile Mike here. Today, I am joined by writer and director Hadley Austin to discuss her powerful documentary, Demon Mineral. Filmed over 4 years with Diné community oversight and guidance, Demon Mineral explores the lasting impact of uranium mining on Indigenous communities across the American Southwest. Through the voices of those who have lived with the consequences for generations, the film examines the intersection of history, environmental justice, cultural identity, and the ongoing process of reclaiming this sacred land. Hadley, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today.
Thank you for having me and for that wonderful introduction.
So, you've worked alongside Diné elders and activist communities in this region for many years. What was it about this particular story that made you realize this needed to become your first feature documentary?
Yeah, I like stumbled into filmmaking. It wasn't a thing I like set out to do initially, and I'm very lucky at how this all shook out. But yeah, I moved to that region when I had just turned 18. Like I'd been 18 for like days, like maybe a month, when I moved there, and I lived next to an active uranium mine. Next to is maybe a little bit dramatic. I lived 2 miles from an active uranium mine. The ore was being transported through town. At the time, that mine was called Canyon Mine. They've since renamed it Pinyon Plain. And this was also the time when Yucca Mountain Storage Facility, which itself it's very long. It's got a very long history, but at the time in Nevada, there was a nuclear storage facility that was active at that time called Yucca Mountain. And so nuclear waste was coming through town on trains and in trucks along I-40 and on the railroad tracks, the BNSF railroad tracks that go through the middle of town. And town was small. I mean, I lived in rural Arizona. It was a really strange context to encounter the realities of radioactive contamination kind of all at once. The folks who are in Demon Mineral were born into this intergenerational struggle. I moved into it, and I moved right onto the edge of it, right? Like I did not have a home that looked right out onto a uranium mine, as pretty much everyone in the film does. A former uranium mine, the mines that they live near are no longer active. But yeah, in those years, which are very formative, when you're 18, everything you do is kind of a big deal. I met a lot of elders and worked with a lot of elders just on practical things, on finding safe ground to plant their gardens, moving houses, because many of them lived in homes that were built out of uranium rock that had been like blasted out of the mines. It was everyday stuff that I think is like kind of unusual for people in other parts of this country. And then as I got older, obviously that struggle continues. It has continued. Many improvements were made in that time. In 2005, for instance, the Navajo Nation banned uranium mining on what legally is in the United States called reservation land. So the Navajo Nation banned uranium mining on that land that they can make that demand over. And they also banned transportation of radioactive goods around that time. And a lot of the radioactive homes that are built out of uranium or rocks that were blasted out of the mines, a lot of those homes were knocked down. Really good things were happening. But it's a forever issue. And also in that time, some not great things were happening. So right before I made Demon Mineral, there was a mine spill, the Gold King mine spill. It spilled into the San Juan River. It's where people on the eastern side of the Navajo Nation get their water. Many people in the Navajo Nation do not have access to safe water, and the reason for that is contamination. It's not that there's not water, it's that the water table is contaminated with radioactivity, or with other things from other mining enterprises. And so anyway, after the Gold King mine spill, the U.S. government delivered water to this community that was impacted in old like, I don't know what had been in the barrels before. I had heard that it was oil. But what we do know is that the barrels weren't clean and there were oil slicks on the top of the barrels. So, like, not great water was delivered to a community that had just experienced water contamination.
Right.
And they were already sitting atop a water table that was damaged, right? So, like, their secondary source of water had just been contaminated, and now they're receiving contaminated water. I was just furious. Like, it's just the kind of thing that makes you mad, you know?
Yeah,
And
of course.
this was simultaneous to the Dakota Access Pipeline protests at Standing Rock. And that was really interesting timing because that water hadn't been damaged yet. And the whole world cared about that water that hadn't been damaged yet.
Yeah.
And the whole world was watching. You know, the whole world was watching because there was a lot to see. There was a giant burned out tank in the middle of a road, you know? There were standoffs between unarmed protesters and, you know, riot cops, like, on the regular. And so we were all watching this from afar. And then at the same time, on the Navajo Nation, there are people who haven't had safe drinking water since the Kennedy administration. And I was like, well, but nobody's looking there because there's no spectacle, you know? And I was saying this to my partner, Yoni Goldstein, who's a director and also a cinematographer, and he was like, you know, you should make a film about that. And he was like, I'll shoot it.
There you go. That's half the challenge right there. How do I shoot it? Okay, cool.
Yeah. And so in a lot of ways it felt like, you know, a continuation of work I'd been doing for, I mean, I'm in my mid 40s now. So a continuation of work I'd been doing for over half my life, you know, just in a new form. And it was very edifying. It was a wonderful thing to get to do.
And to that point, and you talked about some of it right there, one thing I appreciated about the film is that it really dealt with these complex scientific and environmental issues over years, spanning years, but it never really felt inaccessible, which was nice. So as you were structuring this, how did you go about making sure you balanced the information, the emotional storytelling, and the clarity for the audiences who might be hearing about this for the first time?
I appreciate that question so much. Thank you. It feels like such an affirmation. Just sometimes you just want your labor to be visible, you know? Yeah, that was truly a challenge. I really wanted to make something that was useful and that would be useful for a long time because this is a forever problem. And even though improvements have been made, more improvements need to be made, and we need to approach this as a situation that can be improved, you know, otherwise we get really nihilistic and we stop progressing. So I wanted to make something that would be a useful tool for that endeavor. And in that way, I felt like it needed to be both educational and accessible. Mm-hmm. But I also really wanted it to be beautiful because this part of the world has been wastelanded legally, you know, like the Nixon administration labeled it a sacrifice zone. The earliest scouts sent there from the U.S. government literally used the word wasteland in the like 1840s. They literally used the word wasteland in their description of it. And it's also often depicted as like a land of conquest, you know, like in Westerns. And I really wanted to, along with everybody who worked on the project, because it was truly collaborative, you know, these kinds of films don't exist without the people who are in them.
Right.
And so, you know, I wanted to work with everyone to make something that captured the inherent value and beauty of the place. And I really wanted to give the land a voice. And all of that is very poetic, you know? And so the film really was trying to balance accessibility, being informative, being aesthetically pleasing, and also being kind of true to its poetic self, you know. I wanted it to be art, you know. And I ended up viewing it less as a film and more as a tapestry. And so I like had these 4 threads, and I would weave them through. And I think one thing that really helped was that for 10 years, I was a school teacher on Chicago's West Side. I taught high school, and so this game of making something that might seem odious or overwhelming, making it instead kind of wondrous was something I had a lot of practice at because I had to keep a room of 43 people staring at me and
Right.
and engaged. And so I did use a lot of those tools um, but along the way. But honestly, I really think it helped to think of it in some ways not as a film. And then I had to go back and go, but it is a film.
It is.
And so then I had to, give it an emotional arc, because it's not really a chronological film. It's more of an essay,
Yeah.
but it still needed a kind of emotional journey, I think, to give people a cohesive experience for viewing. And that was sort of the last pass,
Yeah. And a lot of the people in the film, I mean, you've worked with them, so you've developed relationships with them, and it's one thing to have a conversation, but it's another to be like, okay, now we're going to put this on film where, to use an expression you discussed earlier when we were off camera, to put something in perpetuity. So, and these stories are so personal. How did you go about building the trust with all of the people that you interviewed to get them comfortable to tell these stories?
I think that I think that consent is really important in this endeavor. I think I'm making other films. This is now my primary practice because I have found my voice and my medium at this stage. But I still don't know if there's a way to do it ethically. If I'm being really honest, but I do my best, and I hope everyone else does too. But one thing I did was assure everyone and then follow through on that they would have authority over their depiction in the film. So everyone in the film who you see, they also saw those sections. They saw the whole film too, as much as they wanted to. Some people have more time than others. Some people are more interested in others. Some people are like Secretary of Interior Holland, which is when I was editing the film, she had become the Secretary of Interior. She was not like, oh yes, let me pour over this small potatoes film in my,
Right.
interview that I gave for it when I was a state representative. She didn't, but I did email her office and I gave her the
Right.
option, but yeah, so folks in the film got to weigh in. And, there were a couple of, for instance, specific examples. Lisa, who is the young woman with very long hair who you see with the rocks, she at one point was like, I don't really like how I'm talking about my job here. She wasn't saying anything bad. She just had used some words that she didn't feel like were quite the right words and whatever. So we cut it out. We were like, okay, and then, obviously another really challenging section of the film in this regard was Dr. Tommy Rock's testimony before Congress. And that, we back and forth to that 5 times. Honestly, I don't even know if he was happy with how it was cut in the end, but we had reached like a kind of mediation because it was almost impossible to cut in a lot for like so many reasons.
Right.
It was, there were length considerations. There's just what happens is awful in that scene, but he had agency and he knew he had agency and and he still tours with the film and we're friends, So, but yeah, it was one of those where it was like, well, this is really hard and we're going to do it together, even though it's harder to do it together. And I think that was just being very collaborative.
And to that collaboration, so in addition to all of the talking head interviews that you have, you also embedded some classic cinema scenes talking about, how the land was used. We have the sojourn where we go to France for the Marie Curie exhibit, the hearing, and all these different pieces, as well as getting these emotional anchors in the story. So what was the process like as you worked with Timothy Fryatt and Nynaeve Laura Minier, your editors, to develop this package?
Tim is a saint. We edited for like 2 years. Not constantly, obviously. we he he did a lot. It was a really small team. We had a really tight budget. You know, we are asked at interviews all the time, who's your archivist? And it was like, well, primarily me, but also the editor, and then also our cinematographer.
Right.
Like, um, and yeah, it was long, and it was a lot of arguing. But I also think,
Which can be productive.
oh, it is. Yeah, I mean, I think people argue about things they care about.
Hmm.
And I think it was about giving the film the respect it deserved. And a lot of things that are really great in the film were Tim's idea. I wanted to have text on screen because it's an efficient way to get a lot of information, and
Hmm.
people don't like to be talked at. And so this was important to me, and Tim was really opposed to text on screen. And then we back and forth, and he was the one who actually came up with this sort of um, blanked out, the almost poet. It's almost look they almost look like lines of poetry, but they're from
Yeah.
scientific papers. Um, that was his idea, and it was the right idea. That was exactly how that information needed to be conveyed. Um, and Nenev hopped on at the very end because Tim and I were so in our heads. We had been in it for so long,
Yeah.
we lost perspective. And Nenev was very generous because she's, you know, a bigger deal than than we are in a lot of ways, more established in her career and so on. But she was very generous with her time and her rate, and she, essentially gave us like our sort of a consulting editor's view at the
Right.
very end as we were doing our final passes. And so some of the little finest touches were Nenev, and also and I don't think this is nothing, which is why I bring it up, but also just like a kind of um, boost, like almost like a reality ballast to be like, no, it's okay. I think it's fine. Actually, it's good. It's good. Good job.
Yeah.
This part works. Keep it. Because we were just in a frenzy.
Yeah. And in addition to everything that was being edited together, visually, the film kept shifting between black and white imagery and color. And not just loose, it felt very intentional. So I'm wondering how you and Yanni, your cinematographer and your partner, how did you develop that visual language, and what did those choices allow you to communicate?
So the black and white is infrared, and the infrared was Yoni's idea. Uh, we'd been grappling with, because uranium mining, especially out in the Four Corners region, is soft shale mining, which means that most of those mines are not really visibly obviously mines. You do see one kind of obvious mine that, Dr. Tommy Rock was like, oh, I'll show you a mine that looks like a mine. Because we were like, we need a mine that looks like a mine. That's not just like some weird small hole in the ground that might not be a mine.
Right.
So that was, hauling all of our equipment on foot up a mesa for 2 miles, or more. But, for the most part, the uranium mines don't look like mines. And so we were grappling with, like, how do we show that this is unnatural? How do we show that this is dangerous if we can't even see that it's a mine? And Yoni sort of came to the poetic notion of showing invisible danger with invisible light, essentially, right? So the infrared captures an image with light that our eyes cannot see. And actually, to that end, you can see some things in there like methane gas and radon gas every once in a while in the images. Sometimes people who see it think it's heat, but it's not. It's gases coming out of vent holes that have been put in place for the safety of the miners many years ago. And it was important to me that those images be black and white, because infrared can look like a lot of things.
Right.
Infrared can look like crazy purples and
Hmm.
pinks and kind of like alien landscapes. And I really didn't want to do that because I both wanted to acknowledge the John Ford, John Wayne sort of origins of how many Americans first encountered images of these places and kind of reclaim that and
Mhm.
in this making an anti-Western kind of way. But I also wanted it to just be beautiful. Not, I do think there's something mildly unnerving about the black and white. And I think that's fine because nature is big and overwhelming and it can mess you up. So it can be mildly overwhelming, But I wanted it to be very beautiful because I wanted people to care about this place. And I think one of the ways that you make people care is by transporting them there. So all the black and white infrared images you see in the film are places that have experienced abuse from mining. So those are places that have radioactive contamination of some level present. Indoors is in color because you're safer there. There is literal truth and functionality to duck and cover, which is shocking. But literally barriers as thin as windows and walls between radioactive contaminants are effective to a large degree, though not entirely. So indoors is in color, and then anywhere that was filmed outdoors, not near a mine. So for instance, Clayson Benulli's interview, which is in color, that was filmed not near a mine, and so that's outdoors but in color, right? But then when we have Clayson playing with his sister Janita, that's next to a mine, so that's an infrared.
Well, I have to say, congratulations on finishing your first project, right? It's always
Thank
such an
you.
accomplishment to get that first film done. And as you move forward, and you said you're working on other projects, I love to ask this question, especially
Yeah.
for first-time filmmakers. What would you say is one best practice you learned on Demon Mineral that you want to take into future projects? And what might be a learning curve you're going to try to approach differently?
Yeah. Um, yeah, I think I would really like to make all my projects in this collaborative way. Uh, I think that it's harder, but it's important. And I think that um, it's potentially such an extractive endeavor making a documentary. And so anytime we can do it in a way that's warmer and more inclusive and more collaborative, I think it sets a good precedent. And I think that I did not realize how time intensive and expensive life after the film is finished is.
Mm,
So, for instance, Demon Mineral had an extensive impact campaign that was multi-pronged, and so we did free screenings of the film anytime the film was screening at a festival and the location was anywhere near where many people who are displaced by radioactive contamination live.
right.
And so those free screenings, that was a lot of work, and I did that. I mean, with other people. Our narrator in the film, Emma Robbins, helped with that a great deal. And we were very fortunate that Alnoba and the Redford Center supported that financially to a degree, but a lot of our own money went into that, and just so much of my life and life energy went into that. And then also the film had an impact campaign with grassroots organizers
Mhm.
and grassroots groups that are doing advocacy for cleanup, and then the film also had a political life that I didn't even seek out. Um, the Navajo Nation EPA tried to screen it, give it a congressional screening before the Downwinder funding was renewed, and so on and so forth. And so, all of that involves a lot of travel. All of that involves a lot of time. And I think that I would in the future, and I hope I am able to allocate time a little better for that, and also raise adequate funds for that part of it. I kind
Yeah.
of hit I was like, oh well, we've raised some money for the impact campaign, and we finished post. I mean, this should be fine. It's like a year and a half of just
Right.
breakneck speed, like
Yeah.
wandering around with this film.
And as audiences watch Demon Mineral, and maybe it's something you've heard from some of the earlier screenings or something you hope comes from later ones. What are you hoping that people take away from the film after they spend, like you said to me earlier, 88 minutes in this world?
I hope they go and touch grass. I hope that I really think it's important to be connected to nature, or what we call nature. I think it is so important to be connected to the land. Um, I it is just absolute fact that everything in your life comes from the earth, and your bones are made of earth stuff, and like, to act as if we are separate from it is false and will only lead to just sort of a collective destruction. And I think that the Navajo Nation shows that in a lot of ways, right? Here is a very large community that is surviving in the face of collective acts of destruction, right? I mean, some of this uranium was used to blow people up,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
and was mined for like very nefarious reasons. Some of it was mined for more sort of frivolous reasons, like pottery glazes and glow in the dark paint and stuff. But I think that yeah, I really hope that people leave this film with a care and affection for this place that I love so much. And I hope that they also leave with a kind of desire to go, like, be closer to the trees. you know?
Well, Hadley, thank you again so much for taking the time to speak with me today. For everyone watching, we'll include information in the description below about the film, how you can go about seeing it. As always, if you enjoyed this conversation, be sure to like and comment and subscribe to the channel for more filmmaker interviews like this, festival coverage, spoiler-free reviews, and other award season content. And as always, folks, this is Cinephile Mike reminding you to take a break and watch something new. Hadley, have a wonderful day. Thank you
Oh, you
again.
too. Thank you so much.